Okay, we were discussing the lower esophageal sphincter. Basically, it's a physiological sphincter and it opens in response to a primary peristaltic wave. It also relaxes to allow air to escape from the stomach during burping and at the time of vomiting, as we already discussed. Now, there are some factors. They influence the functioning of lower esophageal sphincter. The amount of food, the type of food, the gastric distension, various GI hormones secreted in the GI tract, the drugs, the smoking habit, the arrangement of muscle fibers, and even the fibers they respond differently for specific neurotransmitters. The differential response is also important. And finally, the diaphragmatic contractions and the situation or the location of lower esophageal sphincter and its relationship with the diaphragm. These factors do influence the lower esophageal sphincter function. Code was the person who first demonstrated the presence of physiological sphincter using manometry. Normal lower esophageal sphincter is about 3 to 4 centimeter long and the normal pressure recorded there is 10 to 25 millimeter of mercury. Nowadays, lower esophageal sphincter pressure is measured by perfused tubes or micro transducers. There is a term known as dent sleeve. Basically, dent sleeve, it's a device that straddles the high pressure zone for accurate measurement of sphincter relaxation. Very important in diagnostic purpose of various motility disorders of esophagus. Another term is manometry. This is helpful in diagnostic purpose for various esophageal disorders. It is also used to assess the speed and amplitude of esophageal body contractions, and it ensures or tells us that peristalsis is propagated down the entire length of the esophagus or not. This physiological sphincter, the lower one, it is formed due to 4 basic phenomena. This LOS, it is situated left to the 11th vertebra, thoracic vertebra. There is no specific sphincteric muscle present in the LOS, but these 4 points are important. The esophagus enters the stomach at an acute angle. So this acute angle word is important. The walls of intra-abdominal esophagus is compressed when there is positive intra-abdominal pressure. So compressed wall of intra-abdominal portion. This is important. The folds of mucosa, it occlude the lumen. And finally, the right crus of the diaphragm, it has a pinch cock effect. And in combination, all these 4 factors, they are responsible for the function of this lower esophageal sphincter. Here you can see the site of lower esophageal sphincter. You can see the Z line. This is a junction of esophageal and gastric mucosa. This esophagus is made up of the outer longitudinal muscle fibers and inner circular muscle fiber. In thoracic part, basically the serosa is absent. However, it is seen in intra-abdominal portion. Now let's come to the discussion of various types of peristalsis or movement that is present in esophagus. Basically, there are three types: the primary peristalsis, the secondary peristalsis, and tertiary peristalsis. Let's discuss one by one. Well, the main function of the esophagus is to transfer the food from the mouth to the stomach in a coordinated manner. When we start having a meal or a food bolus, the initial movement from our mouth is voluntary in nature. Let's start with the pharyngeal phase of swallowing. It's voluntary and it involves the sequential contraction of the oropharyngeal musculature, followed by closure of the nasal and respiratory passages to prevent the aspiration. Then cessation of breathing, and finally the opening of the upper esophageal sphincter. All these four things, it happen in a very coordinated manner, voluntary in nature. Beyond this level, that is pharyngeal phase, the swallowing is involuntary. Body of the esophagus, it propels the bolus through a relaxed LOS into the stomach, sometimes taking a small amount of air with it. Now, what is the clinical importance of knowing this? During the diagnostics of various disorders of esophagus, in radiographs, we'll discuss later on in subsequent lectures, we usually see air trapped in or with a bolus of barium or food going towards the stomach. So sometimes it poses some difficulty in various differential diagnosis of esophageal disorders. Now, the primary peristalsis. Very important thing is, this is always followed after a voluntary swallow. It's a coordinated esophageal wave that follows a voluntary swallow. This is under vagal control, and there are very specific neurotransmitters that control the function of lower esophageal sphincter. So important word in primary peristalsis is it always originate after the act of voluntary swallow. Secondary peristalsis. This is a normal reflex response to a food, bolus or reflux material coming from the stomach. This secondary peristalsis is designed to clear the esophagus by a contraction that is not preceded by a conscious swallow. This is the basic difference between primary peristalsis and a secondary peristalsis. But important thing is, the majority of clearance swallows to neutralize reflux gastric acid are achieved by primary peristalsis, not the secondary peristalsis. Why primary peristalsis? Because it carries saliva with its high bicarbonate content down to the lower esophagus, hence neutralize the gastric acid. And finally, the tertiary contractions. These are basically non-sequential, random, non-peristaltic waves that are infrequent, less than 10%. During lab-based manometry, it has been detected. Not so important. Now, till now, we have discussed the musculature, the anatomy and function of esophagus, the various endoscopic landmarks, the esophageal sphincters, the upper one and the lower one, then the primary peristalsis, secondary peristalsis, and tertiary peristalsis. Now, very briefly, let's go through the symptoms of esophageal disease. Later on, in subsequent lecture, we'll discuss these symptoms and will be correlated with the specific presentation of esophageal disorders. Let's quickly go through it. Basically, any esophageal disease, the four important symptoms are there. The first one is esophageal dysphagia. It has been described as difficulty in swallowing of food or fluid sticking. If these complaints are there, we must rule out malignancy. This is the importance of this esophageal dysphagia. Then next term is odynophagia, that is painful swallowing. The dysphagia was difficulty in swallowing. This odynophagia is painful swallowing. It suggests the inflammation and ulceration present in the esophageal mucosa. The third symptom is, the common symptom is heartburn. Could be due to regurgitation or reflux, very commonly seen in gastroesophageal reflux disease. And finally, the fourth very common symptom of esophageal disease is chest pain. It must always be differentiated with the cardiac origin diseases. Now let's discuss dysphagia. It is difficulty with swallowing. It is having basically two phases. The voluntary phase dysphagia. This voluntary phase dysphagia is basically suggestive of the chronic neurological or muscular diseases. It starts in the oral or pharyngeal phase. Patients will usually say that they cannot swallow properly, but classically there is no history suggestive of food sticking. Whenever patients try to initiate a conscious swallow, food fails to enter the esophagus or stays in the mouth or enters the airway, causing coughing or spluttering, suggestive of chronic neurological or muscular diseases. Whereas in involuntary phase dysphagia, and it is very important to differentiate between these two, voluntary and involuntary phase dysphagia. This involuntary phase dysphagia is most of the time suggestive of malignant disorder of esophagus or some benign pathology in the esophagus. Esophageal dysphagia occurs in this involuntary phase. There is a sensation of food sticking, and it is very characteristic of this esophageal disorder. It may occur acutely or sometimes in a chronic manner. It can affect the solids and or fluids. It could be intermittent or progressive. Most of the time, many patients point to a site of impaction of this food bolus, but it's a very unreliable feature, so it should not be taken into account. The second symptomatology is odynophagia, that is painful swallowing. It is basically seen in two different types of patients. Now this is seen in basically two types of patients: patients with reflux esophagitis and patients with infective esophagitis. The patient of reflux esophagitis, they complain of odynophagia as they feel retrosternal discomfort within seconds of swallowing hot beverages, citrus drinks, or alcohol. Whereas the patient with infective esophagitis, they are having history suggestive of some chemical injury to the esophagus. In these two cases, this odynophagia is usually present. Regurgitation and reflux. Kindly correct the spelling of reflux. This is reflux, R-E-F-L-U-X. We should differentiate these two terms very carefully. The regurgitation means So return of the esophageal contents from above a functional or mechanical obstruction means there is distal obstruction and the contents are coming because of that distal obstruction, that is returning back, that is regurgitation. Whereas reflux is this a passive return of gastroduodenal contents towards the mouth as part of gastroesophageal reflux disease. There is, as such, there is no distal obstruction in reflux. This is the basic difference of regurgitation and reflux. The loss of weight, anemia, cachexia, change of voice due to refluxed material irritating the vocal cords, and cough or dyspnea due to tracheal aspiration may be associated with either of these. And finally, the chest pain. The differential diagnosis of this symptomatology is basically angina, and it should be differentiated with gastroesophageal reflux disease and other motility disorders of esophagus. Sometimes exercise induced chest pain can be due to reflux, and we are just taking it as some cardiac disorder. Till now we have discussed the anatomy, physiology and various symptoms of esophageal disorders. In the next subsequent lectures we'll go through the investigation part, and these are the special investigation done for esophageal disorders: radiography, endoscopy, endosonography, esophageal manometry and 24-hour pH recording. In next subsequent lecture I'll again come back to you. Thank you.